Hello and welcome to the AutoTalk Weekly Wrap. It has been some time, but we are back. We had a bit of a gap there, various things going on, bit of travel, bit of unwell after travel, and then a few too many events on. It's just busy for everyone, I suspect, other than necessarily car sales at the moment. But to confirm that, I'm going to bring in to the room my usual cohorts. Sitting over in Australia, and I suspect feeling it maybe a smidge worse for wear, Graham McDonald. How are you today, Graham?
I'm bright and sparkly, Richard. What do you mean?
Well, you do have a habit of having to AMVIA meetings in Australia, and maybe having a few chilled beverages afterwards, I may say. But I'm sure the work itself, though, was worth the effort too.
Yeah, it was actually a really productive meeting. You know, we have an audience in Australia, by the way. A number of different people we spoke to yesterday have been doing some profiling. I guess me, but then also looking at the association and some work done in New Zealand, and it all feeds back to the channel here. So, yep, we have audience in Australia. Welcome on in.
Weird. People would watch this, I do not know. You look at the stats.
I'll tell you why. Because Australia's about 4 or 5 years behind us in a lot of things, and about 20 years behind us in the import sector. So they're looking and they're saying, what's it going to be like tomorrow?
The other stuff we do, I always look at the YouTube numbers and look at the Facebook numbers. And to be clear, the YouTube and Facebook numbers on this thing are appalling. But the LinkedIn viewers on this, we could just do LinkedIn and live on LinkedIn for the rest of our lives and be quite happy in regards to this podcast. So thank you, our LinkedIn viewers. You are fantastic. Thank you to our YouTube and Facebook viewers as well. But LinkedIn's where it's at. Despite at times LinkedIn being a waste of time, toxic cesspit, we hopefully are one of the things that's slightly less toxic and slightly less cesspitty. Now I can see laughing away in the bottom rung here our other usual co-host, David Crawford. David, thanks for joining us too.
Oh, you've just made it toxic now, Richard.
Oh, it's true though.
It is. No, I am listening to that. But good morning, everyone.
Hey, look, at least it's not Twitter.
Oh, the X-Files.
It's X, not Twitter. Richard. Come on, keep up.
It's Twitter and tweeting as far as I'm concerned. Yeah. I mean, if the three of us were live streaming on X, what would that make it?
Z.
Not quite 4X. We aren't quite that pithy yet, Richard.
Deep thought. It's 8 o'clock in the morning over here, and it's just too much deep thought right about now with a hangover.
Yeah, fair enough. So, what have you guys been up to over the last few weeks, David? You get the caravan out, or are you still just putting your feet up and enjoying that retired life?
I'm easing into the retired life. So the morning routine is quite significantly different. I wake up and think, I don't actually need to get out of bed yet. And then I get up and make myself a really nice flat white, sit in my recliner chair, drink the coffee and think about, what will I do today? And having made that decision, the next one is, actually, does it need to be done today or can I do it tomorrow?
Yeah, then you don't do it.
But I've got quite a bit of work to do before I head overseas in end of March next year. I'm planning an 11-week motorbike ride around the USA, but before then I've got to build a new garden shed, pull down 2 old garden sheds, build a sleep out, move my daughter into it, and then sell our other place. A bit going on, but it's just a nice, relaxed life. The pressure of not having to face up to the office each day is quite refreshing.
And Graham, you have had to face up to the office pretty much every day?
Yeah, I have. Between half the team, first of all, being sick, then the rest of the team all bugging off to Australia for holidays. So I was at a last man standing. Yeah, and it's been busy. The retail sector, I don't think I'd speak to anybody that said that it's been a fantastic month of July and August. It's been a really, really patchy. And that just means you've got to work a bit harder. And so we have. And in between all that, there's been things like David Vincent's farewell function. There's been other industry stuff we've been doing. Life. I'm not building garden sheds, David, but life. Oof.
Yes. It's a bit like that. Well, you enjoyed Vincent's farewell. You of course had to stay on the clock, hosting it after all. And I was down the back videoing things and taking photos because I don't get to go to events and enjoy them.
I did take a pot shot at you, David Crawford, just like old times. Um,
I would have been disappointed if you hadn't.
oh, not everyone got it, which is always the point of a good joke, I suppose. It was actually a really good function, and I mean, hopefully, David, if he's watching this morning, this is David Vincent. He may not be. He may have said, "That's it, I'm gone." But I thought it was a nice little, can I use the words, coda for a very, very long career, and some really nice things said, a few jokes, a few little bit in-house bits and pieces here and there. But man, but what a stellar career. And I think it was a really fitting way to end it up as well, and with some good people. I've been out of the loop for a little while, and it's been great to spend time with some really good industry people that if we weren't sharing business with, I'd still actually want to hang out with. And that was a really good night.
I've got a question for you, David. Is it pretty much the end of an era? I mean, you and David were largely attached to the hip for many years when it comes to the VIA, and I think that's part of the reason why people like yourself come back out. We've now seen changes on the board. We've got a new chief executive coming in who's not even based in Auckland. I mean, could this be the day when you stop hosting VIA events and stop necessarily having quite so much involvement in it?
Well, firstly, I was disappointed I couldn't get to his farewell, but we had my wife's 60th birthday party and friends down, so it was a little bit of an awkward time for me. But yes, look, it is a change. It is definitely a changing of the guard. David Vincent and I go back to 2005 when I was general manager at the Ministry of Transport, and the relationship wasn't always an easy one. Neither was it an easy one with the MIA when I was at the ministry. There was a lot of changes coming in at the time. There was the boy racer legislation, but the big one was the initial emissions exhaust rule, which changed the game for both the used and new car sectors. And it was a rough ride for everyone. When I joined the MIA, we tried to have a slightly different relationship than between David and Perry. Most of the time it worked. I think we did agree to agree and agree to disagree. And there were a few touchy moments. I mean, there always will be some tension between the two associations. The trick is to make it creative rather than destructive. But I think now going forward, the whole way in which the industry is working needs to work, has to shift a gear. And that is because it's a different sort of environment. The Y-Gen has a different way of thinking about purchasing vehicles. We've got electrification, decarbonisation, and a political environment that I think is more septic than it has been before in New Zealand's history. We've got a very difficult and challenging political environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, you bastards. It used to be great. I could just pit David and Perry against each other if ever I needed a story, just make up some random thing that someone should be offended about, and they'd both give a post in comments. Half the time, one or either of them would get me to write their comments for them, and I had a story. You guys just had a habit of frickin' agreeing with each other.
Perry couldn't resist. He sent across a little missive, and he just couldn't resist about the 7-year ban. I'm like, oh, for sake, Perry. And it was just like old times, wasn't it? David, you made a really good point, actually, the one that I was thinking about on the night too. Well said. And that is that we are in a new era of our industries. And I think more than ever, we're actually going to have to not just work together, but it's almost now as if the industries could, I don't know use the words merge, but you ask yourself, do we really need to have two strong associations batting away at two different perspectives on the same product?
Well, I
think it's the same product.
Well, I'm not going to agree. I don't think. I mean, I've been giving it a lot of thought, Graham, and there are some differences by nature. So an example of where there would be a significant difference is around the clean car discount. You guys have never liked it. The price goes offshore. I understand why you don't like it. But for the new car sector, that has been a very key policy that has accelerated the uptake of new electric vehicles, which without would have been much more difficult than it has been. So there's a significant difference between policy and operation. But for the other parts, and this is the logic that I used when we tried the MOU, which was where in the new car sector, it's interested in the warranty period. So the new car through to the end of the 3 or the 5 year warranty period. And the used cars, by and large, sort of start picking up pace around that 5 years plus. And so there ought to be a continuum, but it's not quite as straightforward as that. I think that the associations need to do a bit more of what the MIA and the AA did, which was we would often write neutral submissions, but there would be slight differences around various things, but we would support each other where we did and acknowledge areas where we don't. I don't think, we tried that quite a lot, and I was often on the phone to Kit to try and get areas of agreement, but it just never felt comfortable. So it's you got to etch out the patch. What is it that's germane to new vehicles? What is it to used vehicles? Where are the similarities and where are the differences? And once those differences can be acknowledged and planned for, then I think joint submissions with areas of agreement and areas of differences becomes more feasible.
I think we're kind of entering a third age of the associations as such. I mean, you had previously, and probably this more applies to VIA, that kind of era where it was they were just battling for survival, and you could almost look at that to the dairy later era nuke vehicles as well. It was kind of challenges would come up that either kill the industry or not, and you had to fight them on the ground. Then you went into this kind of second era, which was kind of the latter Perry through David, and then yourself, David, as well, where it was people who were working closely within the industry, passionate about the industry themselves, and a lot of discussion, a lot of working together to get things across the line and develop thinking. Now with, and I say this in the most positive way, but now with Amy and with the new Greg at VIA. I've got a picture and name right in front of me. I don't know why I was struggling there. We are kind of entering with this thing where we've got this, I would argue, somewhat disconnected professional lobbyist approach in Wellington, and I think it's going to be interesting to see how that plays and what that means in the long run for topics. I think things are going to be perhaps a little less emotive, a little more matter of fact, it's going to be an interesting period, and we'll touch on Greg's arrival in a minute, but it's an interesting time for him to be coming into VIA, an interesting time for Amy obviously taking over at MIA, and then we have an election coming up, and that's a whole different thing. And before we get on to the news, we've spoken about everyone else is up to. What about me? I've got to have my ego stroked about what I've been doing.
Oh, Richard.
I went to India.
Went to India.
Yeah, and it was great. And we were there with the Mahindra brand. We will do a bigger thing on it later. We just kind of had to clear out the news before we get anything there. It was a very last minute trip over to see some of their manufacturing and testing facilities, have a look at a new vehicle, the Mahindra Scorpio, and just get a feel for what could come from that brand in the future. I think they've got some very good plans for New Zealand, Australia, and South Africa. Very impressive. I've been overseas and seen some development processes and vehicle testing processes before. The Indian stuff was world class, and I think it's interesting that we see at the moment the Chinese obviously having a very big impact on the New Zealand market, and we're seeing potentially other markets wane a little bit. And I think India, it's been said a lot, but I think it could be playing a big role in the near future, and it's for a couple of reasons. India is just developing a middle class at a massive rate. 6 million more people a year come into the economic band where they can afford to buy a new car. So a New Zealand and a half gets into the band where they could afford to buy a new car every year in India. And their car companies over there they're moving to meet that challenge and developing some really world-class cars. They've got thousands of really highly qualified engineers. They're bringing a lot of Indian talent back from overseas, interestingly. They are going big into electrification. So we had a great chat with them there about their plans going forward using Volkswagen componentry in electric vehicles, and we had a look at some of their testing facilities for electric vehicles and heard what's coming. And there's some interesting cars coming out of them. So, I mean, essentially we could see an electric version of their TAR, so an electric Jeep coming to New Zealand, electrified versions of their new global pickup, which we had a look at the Scorpio, which that's based off, which is I'd argue not quite up there with the best in the class yet, but it's $30,000 cheaper, so that makes a big difference. And a few things like in the relatively near future, so the next 24 months, we'll see a 7-seat electric SUV from them, based off the current XUV 700, which is a really, I think, surprisingly competitive vehicle. So interesting to see what's coming out from India, yeah.
Yeah, look, I've been waiting for India to develop because one of the things that I had to say at my time at the MIA was in the early days of accelerating EVs was, well, there's not big right-hand markets in the world, right-hand drive markets. It's mainly, the big markets are all left-hand drive. Well, of course, that changes when India gets up to speed, which they are now doing, and being a right-hand drive. It's a much better fit for South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand. So for us, their development is critical for our own future in terms of accessibility of vehicles that are right-hand drive, that are homologated for right-hand drive. And as they go down that electrification route, that changes the picture altogether much more favourably towards us. So, it's a good development for us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and look, they're working on. They've got their own technology. They're working with others, like they're working with both Volkswagen and BYD on motor and battery technology. So they're bringing in some fairly world-class hardware. Their market is coming up to speed in regards to emissions and safety. I think they still need some convincing to move away from the GN cap standard to a more European equivalent one, but they certainly seem to be adding a lot more ADAS and that kind of thing. Airbags. The government there just seems to be quite willing to push the industry, in that they were behind for a long time, and the government there will just say, we're going to do this and you've got to keep up. So airbags went standard, they made airbags standard. Seatbelts went standard, they made seatbelts standard. And now they've jumped to electronic stability control, they're jumping to 6 airbags potentially, to a whole pile of other features that, I think they're getting there.
Well, that's an important consideration for a future used import market. But for new vehicles, I wouldn't worry about the testing regime, because they have to test for the markets regime. So they'll do what China and the others do. They'll get the ANCAP testing done for new vehicles. So for me, the first critical bit is, can they get the new market sector up and running for cheap and affordable vehicles that are safe? In time, that will also become, I would suggest, quite a strong market for used imports, as long as the domestic vehicles meet our safety requirements. And that's the comment really around the ADAS and the safety testing systems.
Yeah. Well, 7-seat modern diesel-powered SUVs with some fairly serious off-road credentials, which we'll show you in another episode, for under $45,000. It's a lot of value. Now, will the durability and so forth pay out? I think it actually will, because these cars are built to survive India, and we have some interesting video of the roads over there. It's a fairly serious market. So we'll talk about that in the future. But no doubt, I think a few more people might be driving Indian cars in the future, particularly utes. And hey, at the rate others are going, maybe they will have the first kind of proper four-wheel drive electric ute floating around on the market. We'll see how that goes.
So an interesting paradox. I wonder what the Indian version of auction hall curry rice will be once we get across there to buy our used cars.
I don't think you're going to be going over there to buy used cars. Yeah. And interestingly, they have now developed pretty much an age ban. They've got a 15-year age ban. A 15-year-old car's got to go off the road. It's
that's to support their manufacturing. Age bans usually apply in countries where there's good manufacturing. In countries like Australia and New Zealand, you have to have a standards-based approach.
So, and some interesting stuff at the market there. So one of Mahindra's biggest models there for sale is the Bolero, which is an older style pickup truck. And the entry level one of those, and has a fairly hefty payload of well over a ton. You can have one of those on the road new for 12,000 New Zealand dollars. And it's a fairly sizable vehicle. Another interesting thing we heard was that a few years back they required seatbelts and rear seatbelts, which wasn't a big issue for most of the brands except for Suzuki, which for a long time was about 50 or nearly 50% owned by the Indian government. Which, while they had plenty of Suzukis, which would seem familiar to us in New Zealand from coming out of Japan, they were locally engineered versions. Some of them didn't actually have the mounting points in place or the engineering ability to add rear seatbelt mounts easily to the back of these cars, which was interesting. But the government just said, no, you've got to have them, and they get them there. So, very, very forceful, I think. And it's not just the Indian brands that are building there. When we went to the big plant in Pune for Mahindra, pretty much across the road, or around the corner at least, was a substantial Mercedes-Benz factory. With, of course, one of the main leaders there being Lance Bennett from Mercedes-Benz New Zealand. We were hoping to catch up with him, but unfortunately the Prime Minister was in town, which meant that traffic was a little bit slow, so it didn't happen. Yeah. Cool. Let's run through the news before we end up pushing out sometime into Saturday morning. So we'll touch on what we just spoke about, and that is Greg Epps has been appointed the Chief Executive of VIA. He replaces David Vinson. Epps comes to VIA after a year of the Insurance Council as Regulatory Affairs Manager, and prior to this, Epps was well known for his role as Advocacy and Strategy Manager at the MTA. So, an interesting appointment. I think Greg's a great guy and very smart. One of those guys, I think, who thinks and studies before he says anything. Your thoughts on what he's going to be like for the role, David?
Yeah, I, to be honest, found it a bit of a surprising appointment. I think the thing that's useful is that he is Wellington-based. And I noted that you said there was a bit of a disconnect over the industry being in Wellington. I'm not sure that the disconnect is real. I didn't feel disconnected to my sector when I was at the MIA, and 80% of those are all Auckland-based. It's six of one and half a dozen of the other. If you're based in Auckland, you really should be down in Wellington doing the hard yards of talking and visiting people. And if you're in Wellington, you need to get out and visit the members. But the advantage of being Wellington-based and having somebody who's familiar with that and who's worked in a trade association previously that is automotive is Greg comes in with that street cred already established and a network already established. And it's easy for him to walk the halls of power. So I think, it's a good move that VIA has somebody that's Wellington-based to complement an Auckland-based team. Ideally, if I was still at the MIA, I'd want an Auckland-based and Wellington-based team. But it just didn't work out that way. And it depends really what it is that you're trying to achieve with member services and things like that. So I think VIA's got a really good mix now between Auckland and Wellington, skill set wise, research wise, and the ability to influence. So, good move.
Graham?
What he said.
That's
the truth of it. Is that I don't. I hear good things about Greg. I don't know him personally, but I hear good things about him. I know that the team at VIA are pretty excited about his appointment. And you're right, it's probably time to have somebody, if not based in Wellington, at least very familiar with the Wellington halls. And there is probably going to be a disconnect between membership, as it were, in the likes of Auckland. But, VIA's been moving away from that grassroots membership model for quite some time now. And it really is, and I'm sorry if I'm treading on toes and I say this VIA team, but it is really now a corporate-based organisation looking after the corporate end of town. And the ordinary members... And I'm still a member, by the way. The ordinary members, it's not really an organisation for us anymore. We belong for different reasons. So it probably was time to make that shift. We've got an excellent team based in Auckland. I think it could pay really well for the future for the association.
I think the get your key advantage for Greg being down there is not necessarily one of just being close to government, and it's almost part of being away from some of the VIA structure. I think is actually going to be helpful. There are some very strong personalities within the VIA board and VIA council, quite rightly, but there has, I think, been some issues, and certainly in recent years with the CEO and board members, perhaps board members wanting the CEO to do certain things, and there's some conflicting ideas and so forth, as there isn't such a big and varied organisation. And Greg being down there, I think, means it's going to allow some of that direction to distill through the board, from the council through the board to the chairman without quite so much influence. So I think that might be helpful because Greg, I see as more of a thinker. Perhaps I would have thought less of a front man, and I think it's better that there can be a narrower channel of information from him rather than him having to butt heads with some smart people and strong will within the structure. So I think that's a great advantage. Let him get on with the job of doing what they're supposed to do rather than having to necessarily negotiate with key members of the industry. Luckily, he has a fantastic chairman there in Frank Willett, who hopefully will make that channel happen. That would be advantageous.
I'd agree with that. I was having breakfast with Frank about 15 minutes before this podcast, actually. He's over here as well. And I'd agree. I think we've got a dream team. Frank goes a long way back, as you know, within the industry as a very, very smart and astute man, but he's also somebody you can work with. And I think for Greg coming into that role, he's going to have all the backup he could ask for from his chairman. And he's got a team based in Auckland, the tech team in Auckland, Malcolm and Kit, who once again, you've got the right people to support you in every of your lobbying work that you're doing and your research. So he's got things set up really well.
Mm-hmm. I think the important operational bit here is as long as the board doesn't start to get into day-to-day management and sticks to its governance role, then all that Greg needs to do is to understand what the members need and want. So he needs to work with the council, the board, to manufacture the bullets. Greg's skill is in how he fires those bullets. So there still has to be that team thing. I know from my time at MIA, I keep reminding myself, this is not about me. It's not about what I want. It's not about what my views are. I need to understand what are the requirements of the constituent members of the association, what's in their best interest so they can continue to do what they do, which is important, sell new cars, at which they have to comply to regulatory standards. So it's getting that mix right, getting the skill set and the office right, and getting that relationship between the members' needs, and then the abilities for the executive to run the association on a day-to-day basis for the benefit of the members. So I think, Graham, you're right. There's a good mix there. Greg with his legal background, his MTA background, mixed with Kit's really good technical and analytical skills, number skills, and Malcolm's untold years in the industry.
He just knows everything.
That's a resource to die for in a trade association.
Yeah. Right, let's move on to the next piece of news. Well, not really, just I guess an update. If you haven't already read it, the August issue of AutoTalk is out now. It's a really good issue. It's been a bit quiet for news recently. We've seen that through a few of the automotive-related websites out there lately, but we have managed to pull in a heck of a lot of news. So we run through the career of David Vinson. We get a bit of an exclusive answer to us from David Parker about the ongoing process with the Euro 6 emissions rule regulations. The minister there, obviously things have gone back to the market, and they've talking about that again, and he's very much making the right noises about aligning us better with Australia. I hear, interestingly, and David, you may have heard similar things, that a certain person in government who pushed a lot of the stuff has perhaps been stepped back a little bit from the front line, which is interesting news.
I've had a number of chats in Wellington one day, I bumped into some people from the ministry who shall remain nameless, and got the lowdown. And I took the opportunity, even though I'm no longer in the advocacy role, to explain why, from a new vehicle sector, it's so important to line up with Australia, and particularly now that we know Australia's dates. And their observation was, yes, we couldn't understand why it wasn't like this to start off with, and that there has been a change in the team managing this, and the team that has realised, the feedback from industry was unanimous on this point, so they had to have a look at it. I was always hopeful that Parker would make sense of this, because in his role as Environment Minister, on a couple of occasions, he wanted to push something, but he said, tellingly, he said on one of those occasions on TV news, when he was being interviewed, he said, industry's not ready for it. We've got to bring industry along. Otherwise, our environmental objectives won't work. So, he's learned a bit of pragmatism over the years. So I'm hopeful that this will be a lot more sensible. And as we know, the quickest way to reduce harmful emissions is to accelerate electrification.
Yes. Now, so other stuff in the magazine is we look at the Too Cheap Cars AGM, where the deal between Eugene Williams and David Senna for Eugene to sell his shares has to go for a yes or no, and it's not quite as clear-cut as you might think. We touch again on Great Lake Motors being purchased by Inchcape. And our great cover story there is the Pearce brothers, so better known for used imports and putting big blingy wheels on Ford Explorers and Utes. They've taken on the franchise for Morgan. So bit of an interesting one there for those guys. And of course, a bit on our trip to India, which was pretty cool. Anyway, on to the next one. And this is a story that has just done so many views over the last 24 hours. It's been crazy. National Act reaffirm plans to cancel clean car discount. And the reason I find that interesting is because, and it's one of those cases where we've reported this before. We had an interview with Simeon Brown where he said this previously. And I kind of thought it was pretty well known, but apparently not so much. So at the MTA's pre-election debate, they had Simeon Brown, Helen White from Labour, Julianne Genter from the Greens, and Simon Court from ACT. Both National and ACT reaffirmed that their previously announced plans to cancel the clean car discount. They reaffirmed their plans. So they're cancelling the clean car discount, and ACT is also committed to cancelling the clean car standard. Now, they didn't, unfortunately, get a chance to get them to actually lay out a plan for how they're going to do that. It's on its way. So I had a couple of other interviews, a couple of meetings since this happened 2 days ago, and basically it's kind of like the message is, if you want an EV, particularly if you're a fleet, get your order in now, because the chance of there being $7,000 on the table after the end of October is pretty darn slim by the sounds of it.
Well, I've had a number of talks with these gentlemen and expressed develop a plan for phasing out the discount. Don't do it overnight. You do it overnight, it is really counterproductive to the new vehicle sector. You could probably do it overnight for used cars if used cars wanted it. If the industry wanted it to go overnight, you could probably do that. But for the new car sector, it needs to be phased out because vehicles for 2024 have already been committed to by May this year, and some of the distributors would have actually had financial commitments for that. So it becomes quite tricky. And the other tricky bit is, I'm not sure the new vehicle sector wants the clean car standard to go. The clean car standard is a useful tool in terms of driving allocation eventually. But what the new car sector does want is they want the targets to be achievable. They need to be a little bit of a stretch. But what we've got is silly targets that just will kill the industry. So it's going to be really interesting to see how that works. Simeon Brown is not interested, as I understand, in getting rid of the standard. I think the standard is part of the National Party policy, but the discount is going to go. Whether it goes overnight or whether it goes over time is the moot point.
Whether they like the standard or not, they have to do something. And the standard is something that can be seen that doesn't necessarily directly affect, a voter doesn't have to walk up and swipe their EFTPOS card and pay it. is the point.
No, it's paid by the importer for a standard.
That's what I'm saying though. It's the voters are ultimately paying for it in vehicle prices and in vehicle choice. They don't have to go and lay their money down, as is the case. Well, not directly with the rebate either, but with the discount either. But it's a hidden fee compared to other items.
Yeah, they are. They're still paying for it. It's just they're not seeing where they're paying for it. That's all with the scheme. And I think that the discount scheme's going to go. I think that's a given, unless there's just some staggering change in the political sphere in the next couple of months. The scheme, and that just could be all talk, and that's positioning between a major party and a coalition player, just sort of jockeying for position. I think that David's on the money there. The scheme will probably change, but it probably won't vanish. And there's little structural issues all the way through that haven't been thought of. A lot of us out there in the trade land, used or new, we're sitting on a vast repository right now of CO2 credits that we've actually paid for in effect through the process of importing motor vehicles. They actually have a finite value. That's something you just can't disappear overnight with a scheme being cancelled. Stock mix, both new and used, there's lots of different things to unwind there over the course of time. Change, yes. Unworkable targets, absolutely. Disappearance of the scheme, no.
The one thing I got a lot of comfort from in several discussions with Simeon Brown is that he made the comment, it's 2050 neutral carbon, net neutral, net zero by 2050. So this is a marathon, not a race. And my observation to him is, well, that's right, but the way that which the Clean Car Standard is set up, it's a sprint, and we don't need to sprint. It will come in time. All they need to do is make sure the laggards don't get away with continuing to unnecessarily pollute. So that's why you probably still, in New Zealand's best interest, need a standard, but the targets need to recognise that this is a marathon and not a sprint.
Now, if I can go through and just give a bit of an overview of the debate itself, it was an interesting mix of, clean car was a fairly big topic, or electric vehicles themselves. We had a few questions from the crowd, which were really, you always get the usual trope of anti-EV questions. Batteries are bad, blah, blah, blah. The politicians themselves, and the rest of the questions were a lot of a mix of stuff that relates to workshops. Should we have in-service emissions testing? Should we have right to repair? All these kind of things. The politicians themselves, I guess I'll go through and rate them. Simeon did okay, but I think he's in an awkward position where they haven't released their they do have an electrification plan coming, I believe, and they have a real chance of getting into government, so he can't actually really make any promises that at the moment, because who knows, they may have to actually, cash in on them. Yeah, exactly. Helen White, who was drafted fairly late because Michael Woods was supposed to be coming to this initially, and then David Parker wasn't available. So she's on a couple of infrastructure and finance committees. I thought she was actually pretty reasonable for a last minute stand-in, and I think she was trying to bring the reality of what being in government means to it. So shouldn't do well, shouldn't do that badly. Yeah, fine. A lot of people have said Julianne Genter probably seemed to understand the most about what was going on. Julianne Genter at these things does very much want to discuss, obviously, the Greens' message about the environment and what they believe and so forth. And she did do that, probably a little too passionately at times. But when it came down to actual facts, figures, and legislation, she was the only one that was really totally on the money. And you got to give her that credit. She probably lost the room within about the first 30 seconds, but what she had to say was, when it actually came down to transport stuff, was not stupid. Simon Court was an interesting one. You got to like Simon Court because he is a bit of a... He thinks he's a bit of a comedian. He's a bit of a joker. And because they're going to be, potentially a significant coalition partner to National, they are still on the fringes. They can still say whatever they want. And he did that well, and I think he won a lot of friends in the room. But he also said some really dumb things, and needs to perhaps, if he's going to sit in that transport role, look at some of the facts and figures. So there was a discussion around the health impacts of emissions beyond CO2, so particulates, all that kind of stuff. And it started from cruise ships. The message was the same around, predominantly being around vehicles. And he essentially was saying, show me the death certificate where people have been killed by emissions. And everyone in the room who's actually read any of the studies around this and knows that diesel particulate and other stuff literally is directly attributable to premature deaths from asthma and other things like that, was like cringing, and he was doubling down. And in the end, Julie intended literally to pull up her phone and show him the literal data, and even then he still was flippant about it. So it was a somewhat awkward situation. David, you would have read a few of those studies before.
Well, yes, and remember, I was GM when the first Happens report came out, so I understand the methodology really well. And I have to say, I share some of Simon's scepticism around some of the results and the way in which they're purported. But let me clarify, there is no doubt in my mind that harmful emissions creates respiratory problems for a number of people. And so from a health impact, just from a respiratory management perspective, we need to do something in New Zealand's best interest. When you get a report that says premature deaths by days or weeks or even by a few months, categorically that is stretching the methodology way beyond its capability. But when you say that it indicates premature deaths by years, 6 months or more years, then that starts to indicate actually you do have a problem. And if you've got a premature deaths that are occurring because of people not being able to breathe properly, or cancer rates being higher in urban centres where we've got poor air quality versus non-urban centres, then you can say, well, that's a contributing factor, we should do something about it. And the industry's never said we don't want Euro 6 or higher emissions. What the industry has said is give us a timetable that makes sense for us to be able to improve that. And bear in mind there comes a cost penalty, but that's a cost penalty that those who buy vehicles need to take in lieu of getting a better air quality. So you can't deny air quality is a problem. It is, particularly in Christchurch and Auckland. And particulate matters are the ones that are most demonstrably a worry for us as a country.
Yeah, it concerns me when we have someone coming who potentially will have a seat at the table in the next government that is unwilling to acknowledge science in that way. That was my concern.
And I think it would be mine too, Richard. And I think the other thing that I find, I like Simon. I've had quite a few discussions with him over the years, but he's categoric. The only way to deal with greenhouse gas emissions from transport is through the emissions trading scheme. There's a problem. There's a market failure with the emissions trading scheme as it currently stands, if you want to look at it from a control factor for emissions, because it prices carbon too low and it doesn't actually reduce it. So if you've got a problem where carbon isn't priced appropriately for a consequential change, then the emissions trading scheme has to be complemented with something else. And that's why I argue from a New Zealand Inc. perspective, having an emissions standard for CO2, which sets some minimum lines over time that are reasonable to achieve, that is the lowest cost way of achieving our CO2 reductions. You get those targets wrong, and then Simon's right, it's a cost factor that is unnecessarily borne for no environmental change.
What do you think of X plans to shut Wakakatahi?
Nonsensical. I do have concerns about the New Zealand Transport Agency. Its staff numbers have grown significantly from when it was first put together in 2007, I think. And it hasn't actually been allocated a lot more things to do since that time. So I have to wonder about the efficiency of it. But then that's a criticism you can throw at an awful lot of government agencies. They tend to grow under centre-left governments, and then the numbers reduce a little bit under centre-right governments. But yes, I think government per se is too fat. There's just too many people employed in government.
I wouldn't be investing in
National-
central Wellington office space at the moment.
No, I certainly wouldn't
no.
be, no.
No, but X comments about shutting agencies down and doing things is really unhelpful rhetoric.
Yeah.
Well, you made a good point before that I guess ACT are in a difficult position right now, a bit like the Greens really, where they're writing out a lot of checks that I'm not sure they can cash post the election. And that is often the way that minor support parties work, is their job is to talk about the stuff on the side there. They know they're not really going to do, but they can make all the right noise. The problem they've got is like the Greens as well. They've got an audience right now. We've got an era, I think, of public skepticism of government that we've not seen for quite some time. And yeah, it's a COVID hangover. But you talk about the Whakataka Kotahi or the NZTA problem, as it were, that ACT's talking about. And they're cashing in on public sentiment. Now, whether the public sentiment is right or wrong is almost immaterial. People have an active dislike for this quasi-monster of an all-reaching government they see intruding into their transport and other options. And they're going to support ideas like ACTs, that sort of rhetoric, whether they think about it, whether they've got any knowledge of what the backing of it is or not. And that's the dangerous environment politically that we're in. It's not benign, really. There'll be a product, I suppose, of the sentiment of the people. And if the people are badly informed, then it just becomes junk all the way up. So
it's like taking GST off fruit and vegetables.
Oh my God, great idea that one was.
Well, you know how that came about. It was focus groups from Labor, and everybody said, yeah, it's a really great idea. So it's popularist. So now we're starting to see the New Zealand first populist policy for electioneering being mainstreamed by other parties, and that's a real worry. You're quite right, Graham. I think we need politicians to be somewhat cold-hearted. They need to cut costs that are unnecessary, but they also need to be realistic. And that's what we're not getting the fact checking. It's just a lot of noise, and that's why I said earlier on in this podcast that our political environment's become a little bit more toxic than what I've seen in the past, and it's been toxic because it's been driven by populism rather than thinking carefully what is in New Zealand's best interest, what is the country that we like and love, and how do we manage it best. That's what I'm not seeing in this election campaign.
Now, should the polls be true and we end up with a national government or a national-led government at the next election, you guys have both met him. Do you think Simeon will be the next transport minister, or will they perhaps make him associate and use one of their more experienced operators, at least initially?
Oh, I think he'll probably be appointed, going on past behaviour.
Okay.
Oh, lack of experience. Simeon's been around for a little while now, actually. It's not his first rodeo in Parliament, irrespective of in cabinet, or in government or in opposition. And yeah, okay, so maybe he's not the most dynamic of ministers, and I mean that in the best possible way, but I think transport's one of those sectors where you don't necessarily want to have a dynamic minister. You want somebody that gets down and does the job, is over policy, understands the way that the bureaucracies work. They don't have to be a great public face to it, but they actually have to be a worker. There are other portfolios in government that need to have people that are dynamic. This is not one of them.
I'd disagree with you there to an extent. I mean, if you look at the last two national or significant national transport ministers, they were very high-ranking dynamic members of the cabinet. You had Simon Bridges, and before that, Stephen Joyce. National very highly values that portfolio.
Stephen Joyce, because they tied in at that time, and it's actually a good point you've made there. They tied in the need for transport and infrastructure together. So as part of National's process out of the effective the GFC, when National was first elected, was to rebuild infrastructure in the country on an export-led basis to try and get the export sector moving, transport to ports, better access for business, industry. And so they did tie those two portfolios together. They linked them there, and then naturally Stephen Joyce gravitated towards that. This time around, I don't know. I haven't seen any sort of particular talk around those two roles being meshed in together. So
Simeon Brown is liked within the National Party caucus. He's a person who is seen to do his homework. and my experience in meeting with him, I met with him 3 or 4 times before I left. He had done his homework. He'd read the papers. He'd read Via's submission, our submission. He was over quite a lot of the detail, albeit he had a particular philosophical bent about how he thinks transport should operate. So I think I would be surprised, because the other person who would do it would be Chris Bishop, but they've got other plans for Chris. So I think Simeon Brown will be the Minister of Transport. I think he won't be as highly ranked as previous ministers have been. So we'll see. I think the associate will come from the ACT Party, and that's the bit.
It's likely to be Simeon with Simon, and whether they'll probably put a fairly strong infrastructure minister in, I suspect.
But I don't know that
maybe Brownlee.
I don't know that it'll be Simon Court. It may be they do have somebody else who's over transport and ACT as well. So we'll see.
Yeah, we'll see. Right, let's run through the rest of this, because we're already 51 minutes in. We're doing well today, guys. Now, a really interesting story. This funny one that popped up yesterday. Citroën, Auto Distributors New Zealand, the importers of Citroën, Peugeot, Opel, and not sure what else they're bringing at the moment. Anyway, they saying the Ukraine's continuing to affect their supply chain. So they've launched the new EC4 into the country. They obviously have been launching other models for Opel as well, and they have been doing a lot of interesting discounting around that kind of stuff. Very EV and plug-in friendly thing. They've been doing some weird things to get the cars here. So their vehicles are built in Spain, and then they're trucking them up to Belgium to get them shipped, because they can't get on the ships out of France, or at least it's not a high enough frequency. So interesting stuff they're getting cars to get here. Now, considering the amount of discounting they're doing on these vehicles when they land in New Zealand, these things must be sold to them cheap out of the factory to pay for extra trucking. They're all that shipping, and it was just an interesting story that's up there. Probably not much to discuss, but have a look at it. It's really interesting to see what they're having to do to get these cars to New Zealand. I don't know where they're going with that Opel brand. Certainly they seem to be doing a lot of promotion around it, but it's an interesting one to watch.
I've still yet to see one on the road. I'm serious. I'm not being smart. I've still yet to see a single one on the road. I'm sure they're out there.
I've seen them. But maybe I just would live in a quirky suburb. The other observation, Richard, is, and I don't know if it's in one of your tabs up there, but Ford has chartered a ship for 3 years to get their supply to Australia and New Zealand sorted out. Yeah. So look, there are still post COVID, and because of the Ukraine situation, there are logistical problems still for vehicles coming from certain parts of the world.
Yes, yeah. Speaking of logistics, Ports of Auckland posts $40.5 million full-year profit. Port of Auckland has recovered from last year's financial loss on the back of its failed automation project, and posted a full-year net profit after tax of $40.5 million. That's an increase of more than $50 million on last year's $10.3 million loss, with revenue increased to $320.2 million. Shipping everywhere is expensive at the moment, so this is kind of to be expected. You can read more of that at Transport Talk. How are your shipping costs going, Graham?
So take that check and bank it, Wayne. And shipping costs suck. They really do. What a terrible time to be shipping commodities right now, but powerless.
Good for the ports. Good for the ports. Of course. Colonial posts $30.3 million full-year profit. So it can't be that bad out there in dealer land. Colonial Motor Company has posted a trading profit after tax of $30.3 million for its full-year result, down 9% on the previous year. Okay, but a strong result in a tightening market, it says. Total revenue was $997.2 million, so nearly $1 billion in turnover for Colonial. Down from just over $1 billion in 2022. The board declared a fully imputed dividend of 42 cents per share. The chairman noted that light vehicle trading conditions had been inconsistent, through the second half of the financial year, particularly due to changes in the Clean Car Scheme and taxes on higher emitting vehicles driving short-term artificial demand. Coupled with this came the challenge of lumpy supply for key products, I suspect tied to the previous paragraph with the Ford Ranger and how much it cost to put one on the road. Agricultural sector, they say, is struggling and lowering returns, is making it challenging for their agricultural side of the business. But trucks have remained steady. I'll say the same for my business. I can bank on trucks. I always know I'm going to have a good month with Transport Talk. So yeah, interesting result there for them. New facilities around the country. So mixed fortunes there, I think.
Is that to 30 June?
Colonial, Kenworth, DAF, Ford Ranger. That's it. Those are the three things you need to sell. Kenworth, DAF, Ford Ranger.
So is this to 30 June, Richard?
This is, yes, to 30 June or 30 March. I think it's to 30 March. Yeah.
So if you have a look at the annual stats for new vehicles, last year was strong, the year before was strong, the start of this year was strong in terms of numbers, which surprised me. But we're now starting to get into a really rocky period. And I think the commentary from a lot of people has been, as back orders have been fulfilled and shipping logistics have got slightly better, and the economic conditions continue to bite and interest rates get higher, then purchasing of new vehicles becomes more necessary rather than discretionary. We've seen the discretionary buyers start to go out of the market for new vehicles. I would expect to see used vehicles remain a little bit stronger than new, because when people can't buy brand new, they start to buy better used vehicles, whether they're New Zealand new or used imported vehicles. So I think that this is a good return. I would be extremely surprised if I'd be saying the same thing this time next year.
Yep, you'd be a brave person that bought a brand new Ford Ranger or Toyota Hilux tomorrow, isn't it? You'd be particularly if you're buying a whole pile of them, you'd be waiting to end of October, early November to see what happens. I would have thought, just nudge that lease out just a little bit longer.
You would now. I think a month ago, maybe a month and a half ago, there was a bit less certainty. But, it's like an accelerating clock right now. It's racing faster and faster and faster to the 0 point. And I think now you're going to start to see people retract back. And in our sector, the used sector, I think that there might be, depending on where the money is, there might be an uptick in activity towards vehicles that attain a clean car discount, because people are going to work on the basis that at the stroke of midnight, the minute the ministerial warrant is signed, the discount scheme's gone. So it'll work in different ways.
Yep. I know at least one EV heavy company was chatting to me yesterday, and they were really interested in this story from the MTA thing, because to them, that's just marketing gold for the next 3 months, and they can they think they can really push the numbers off that, because $7,000 is $7,000. And
TV1's poll results on Monday night only confirm the shift towards a change in government. It's becoming a bit more certain, and so people can now start to see, discount is, it's 80% certain it's gone now.
Yeah. Vehicle sales a bright spot in Q2, according to ASB. The ASB Bank expected core volumes would be weak in the second quarter of 2023, but anticipated vehicle purchases would provide an offset given change to the vehicle rebate schemes. And Q2's retail trade review notes said that despite a lift in vehicle sales, widespread weakness across most other categories was the dominant theme. Or in other words, artificial demand generated by the Clean Car Standard changes helped New Zealand's economics figures in the second quarter of this year.
And second story is, once again, economists completely fail to understand how the vehicle sector works.
If you're measuring GDP, put a pollution charge on and GDP goes up. How does that work?
Turners anticipating another record result for financial year 2024. Turners Automotive Group has announced it is expecting financial year 24 to be another record profit result for the business. At the annual shareholders meeting on August 23rd, Turners reported that the positive trading results so far have the company on track for the financial year 24 result to be ahead of the record financial year 23 result of 45.5 million net profit before tax. They've done a dividend, saying good supply of vehicles out. they seem to have a good supply of vehicles despite the market overall being constrained. Look, I'm not going to look at that story anymore. Interestingly, anecdotally, I see the Turners guys really on the shuffle at the moment. They seem to be pushing pretty hard. They're sniffing around they backed away from the import trade for a while. They're sniffing around that pretty hard at the moment. They've been opening up new sites. I think it's one of those cases of when everyone's still a little bit cautious, everyone's pulling back. A company like that has the capital in the bank to make moves will make moves. And I think that's what we're seeing with Turners now. They're about to use their size to kind of be able to gain market share and do very well when others are struggling. You get that feel too, Graham?
Yeah, very much so, actually. We talk about them quite a lot on this show, obviously, because they're the major player in New Zealand. But we say the same thing every time. They're extremely well run, very, very good management team, extremely well capitalised, with a long history in New Zealand, and that's the triple treat for being a player.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting to see that Greg Hedgepeth join the elevate his status within VIA for a company that literally 18 months ago said they were out of imports. That's a very telling move. Mm-hmm. Very telling move. Yeah.
I agree, Graham. They've been in the business a long time, really well managed, and got a lot of capital. The economist in me says, the bigger they are, the harder they fall. And there's a risk in growth and seizing opportunity. Sometimes it pays to diversify, but sometimes you've got to stick to your knitting. It'll be interesting to see how this company performs in the future, but unconstrained growth can come back and bite you if you're not careful. But I think at the moment these guys are doing all the right things.
Total aside, but speaking of good management, I met my wife for the first time when I came in for a meeting with Todd Hunter, and she was Todd Hunter's EA. So clearly they make very good managerial decisions. Pardon? Insider
trading there.
Yes. We didn't actually re-meet till a few years later, but that's another matter. Anyway. VIN rear window etching requirement removed. Wakatahi has advised the industry in its publication Inspection News 13, catchy name there, of the removal of the requirement to etch VIN numbers into the rear window of used imports and re-registrations. VIA has notified its members of the requirements removal with an extract from the article. So you no longer have to do that. That used to be a real big thing in the past. That kind of just isn't really been an issue. Yeah.
All this is the removal from the VIRM. No one's been doing it for the longest time. This is old news, and anyone at all that's involved in the compliance of motor vehicles will be scratching their head saying, why is this a story? It's a non-story. Yeah. It's merely the formalisation of the process that's been removed.
Yeah, I thought it had long gone.
Yep.
Yeah. Just a little nice story here. Mitsubishi Motors New Zealand formalises their Task Force Kiwi partnership. Mitsubishi Motors New Zealand has formalised a loan vehicle agreement with Task Force Kiwi following its support of the not-for-profit Cyclone Gabriel disaster relief response. Mitsubishi Motors will supply the organisation with 3 Triton utes to facilitate community projects in Auckland, Wellington and Christchurch. The brand's chief executive, Warren Brown, says the partnership is a small contribution within the greater scope of the work undertaken by Task Force Kiwi's team of volunteers. A few Tritons out there doing some good work in what I'm guessing is some kind of river sludge. I don't know, hard to tell. DPL Insurance received a positive rating from AM Best. DPL Insurance has received a positive long-term issuer credit rating from ratings agency AM Best, revised from the previous rating of stable. AM Best has affirmed DPL Insurance Limited has a financial strength rating. Blah, 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 blah. Just good news there, and that's basically Turner's finance and insurance arm. And, of course, you're going to be stable with a pretty good operation and such a big, well-funded company behind you. Always helps to know that your insurance company's in good shape, though. Now, on to some moving around. Former Holden New Zealand boss is moving to Canada. So, Christian Aquilina, we'll go off piste here. Of course, he was in marketing for Holden Australia, and he did the usual path that they take when they're going to go up the chain. And he came to take over running Holden New Zealand, and did very well at it. They had a great team at that time at Holden New Zealand. Christian Aquilina is that. They had a few other well-known industry identities in the place, and did really well with the brand. Doing so well, they were doing way better than Australia, that when Australia started to go to pot, they dragged him and half the former management team back at the last minute to try to save Holden Australia. That didn't happen, and he had the unenviable job of shutting down Holden Australia. He was rewarded or punished, depending on which way you look at it, with a stint running Cadillac in the Middle East. And now he was stuck there, I guess. It's funny, you know this, David, from watching various people in the industry in the past. Sometimes you can tell when someone within a large global car organization has been left somewhere just a little bit longer than they should be. Whether they're in the naughty corner or whether they've been doing too well. He probably, I think, spent maybe a little bit too long in the Middle East, but he's now got a job running sales and marketing and service for General Motors in Canada, which I would suggest means that he's back on the management escalator again. He's a great guy. He's a really smart operator, and it's good to see that he's been given another chance. Did you work with him much when he was there, David?
I did, and I have a slightly different take on one aspect of your story. Mm-hmm. He was pulled back to Australia not to save GM as it was. He was pulled back to Australia to transfer it to an importing company. So that was not a failure. That was a deliberate plan because New Zealand was an importer and they desperately needed the importation. So when he went back, they already knew that the manufacturing was going. And so his key task was to transform it. He's been in the Middle East a standard amount of time, not a longer amount of time. And it's good to see that he's now got a job into North America, because the person who followed him took over from Australia is now going to the Middle East to take over his job. And there's some hope then that there's a career post the Middle East. There's a lot happening in the Middle East. It's not a dead end beat. It's a difficult area.
Okay.
But the GM sees it as a really important market for it because of the type of vehicles they buy there.
Okay. Well, interestingly, I still think he's in a better place now. I think he's I think that is probably a more clearer path to senior management. But agree to disagree on that one. I got nothing against the Middle East. I just kind of always felt like it was parking him. He was a bit more talented than that relatively small region deserved, in my opinion. But
that's true. He certainly was more talented for that region, but he's done a few things in that region as well. So
Yeah, I always remember when he and Marnie Samphia went across to Australia, and Australia was coming off the back of, because they had switched to an importing company before his arrival. Basically, they'd had a terrible launch program for the imported Commodore, really bad. The ads were pretty tone deaf and just a bit weird, and they very quickly took the marketing for the ads from New Zealand and reshot them or relabeled them into Australian ads. So they had this Commodore ad talking about Everest and all sorts of stuff like that. And they remade all these Australian ads all New Zealand ads for the Australian market in a very big hurry. But it was a little bit late in the piece. But no, good to see him up there. He's a good guy. And Mark Epplow's moved on. And I think we get into it further on the track. We have let me see if I can find it here. Further down. Oh, there we go. General Motors has appointed an Australian, Jess Barler, as its new Managing Director of General Motors Australia and New Zealand, effective September 1st. She's most recently been... Pardon?
Not long now.
Yeah. So she's been at Cadillac as Director of Global Product Planning and Product Strategy, and played a central role in Cadillac's transition to an all-EV brand by the end of the decade. Now, of course, that's interesting. She's coming here because, as we've already previously reported, Cadillac is coming back to New Zealand, Australia with an electric vehicle. So, interestingly, I think she probably marks a little bit of a change in the tone of what GMSV is doing in Australia and New Zealand. They're currently basically converting pickup trucks, and I suspect that this indicates the shift towards actually having some fully built-up vehicles coming in more premium brands. So, be interesting to see where that one goes.
This has been a carefully thought out plan by GM. So they knew that it was going to take some time to become an importer. So when the Commodore and Holden brand disappeared out of Australia, they decided that they wouldn't race into being an alternative importer of just different models picked out from somewhere else and converted to Australia and New Zealand specs. They've taken the opportunity, I think, to rebrand themselves, taken the opportunity to think carefully about what sort of vehicle they want to bring into the market. So sticking with the speciality vehicles for a little while, I think sets the scene quite nicely for the more upmarket Cadillac EV brand to then complement that.
I think they also needed a gap really to disconnect themselves from legal or contractual legal concerns around the Holden Australia network. I mean, if they'd just gone straight out and come back in with all different brands and not necessarily the same footprint, I think that would have been complicated for them.
The Australian scene was very difficult.
Yeah. Here's, I guess, a total sideways on it, is that there is some discussion around the industry that they were a fairly long way down the track about MG's launch into Australia and New Zealand essentially being under the Holden brand. And that would have been interesting to see how that would have gone should it have happened. Because it's surprisingly well how it's surprising. It's interesting to see how well MG's done with that brand in New Zealand and Australia. Would it have been any different if those vehicles had arrived with a Holden badge? And it's not without precedent in that, say, India is a market where it is, and there's certainly other markets where it's been the case where some of that MG product's actually being sold as a Chevrolet as opposed to as an MG. So it's the things that could have happened after the Holden end. Speaking of another new brand, Chery has confirmed that it's got 10 Kiwi dealers signed up. So Chery New Zealand country manager Sheldon Humphreys has confirmed to AutoTalk that 10 dealerships have been appointed, but are yet to be named by the Chinese manufacturer in what will eventually become a network of more than 30 sites nationwide. They have, and I'll start speaking off the story here, I was chatting to Sheldon recently, Chery is not technically going to be their main brand in New Zealand. They're going to sell under the Amoda and JQ brands. Amoda is kind of their electrified vehicle SUVs, forward-looking stuff. JQ more premium, and they aren't going to lead with a petrol turbo SUV as they have in Australia. In New Zealand, the intention is to start with an electrified model and add PHEVs after it, with it being unlikely they'll do full petrols unless there is significant changes to the clean car standard. Maybe the discontinuation of the rebate might change that. But another Chinese brand coming in. I think it's a smart move. They're going electric. That is it. We'll slip on to the next one. We've got a little bit of coverage here on David Vinson's retirement function that we discussed it earlier. Some lovely photos there. Feel free to jump in to the website and have a look at those. I've still got to go and re-add a picture of you, Graham.
Apparently I wasn't there.
You were. We'll forgive you. So that's that one there. And then dealer staff appointed to Automotive National Industry Advisory Group. Rutherford and Bond, Toyota, Poirot Capity branch manager Craig Martin and Density Motor Services manager Matt Green have been appointed to the National Advisory Industry Group for the automotive sector. European motor distributors, parts and distribution manager Douglas Blair has also been appointed to the what's going on there? To the Automotive NIAG. Good to see dealers are being represented. I'm going to admit I'm totally lost here. This is not my story, and I have no idea who this group reports to. David, do you have any clue?
I read the story, and I think it's. I'm not overly familiar with it, to be honest. I think it's dealing with some technical information around parts and supply and automotive standards for training and skills. Yes. Sorry, Workforce Development Council. Yeah. There you go. I got confused by the name change. So Workforce Development Council. So, but anyway, great to see that there's more industry experience being used in working on these things. Few quick ones before we kind of wrap this up. ID4 and ID5 have been launched by Volkswagen New Zealand.
these are set already this year to basically overtake the Golf as the most popular selling Volkswagen. So that's going to be the first time in 20-something years that the Golf is not the most popular Volkswagen. Interesting one there. Pretty cool cars. Have either of you had a look at them yet?
No.
No, I haven't.
The Tiguan drivers at Croydon's aren't tempted to switch over to an ID4 gram?
Oh, let's just not go there, Richard. That's just no. Let's just not go there.
We mentioned earlier Ford's Grand Quest to reduce delivery times to New Zealand and Australia. Ford Australia has signed a 3-year lease deal on a roll-on, roll-off car carrier in an effort to reduce customer wait times for new vehicles. Named Grand Quest, the ship will deliver vehicles from Ford's Thailand plants to customers in both Australia and New Zealand. Capacity of 2,600 vehicles and will reduce waiting times. Now, I think this is more complex than just simple row capacity. I think what they're trying to do with this is, and you guys may have some information that I don't, help them get past the actual port logjam that's a problem over there. I understand already to do that, they are containering some vehicles into Australia. And I know that because some members involved in the New Zealand import industry, their associates in Australia have actually been doing some work divanning some of these Ford Rangers that are being contained into Australia to avoid the queues over there. Very complex issue over there. They've always had issues with their ports due to unionisation in part.
But this is also tied up with biosecurity and approved pathways for product. And the difficulty is that unless you've got a dedicated vessel where you only got your brand vehicles in it, you can't be 100% certain for being free of contamination. So not only have we got sort of some union challenges over there, there have been some issues around biosecurity. And this is quite a neat way of tying the two together and having a different strategy for a little while. I'm surprised it's taken somebody this long. I would have thought Ford and Toyota might have started to do this sooner because the shipping patterns post-COVID have gone east-west really well. That north-south pattern hasn't kept up. Well, the north has because the bigger market's going north from Singapore. But coming south is still a challenge. And then you have to then manage the port logistics.
We've seen something recently in New Zealand with, Graham, you might be aware, Nichibo, I believe, had their own charter that came down with a delivery.
Yeah, they have. I think that's. I'm not sure. I think it's 6 sailings. I heard. Is it 6 sailings they're chartered for? And they hope to clear the logjam. But I think there are still issues, even if the number of vessels themselves, or ships, as I've been told to say, number of ships on the marketplace itself increases. There are still those logistical situations in Australia that are causing immense logjams, and the biosecurity debate. And as it's put to me by somebody just yesterday, that the biggest issue is this 10-day stand down from sign off from MAF around the biosecurity of a car. That's bad English, I know, and a sailing date puts all sorts of pressure on ports that are constricted around space and movement. And it doesn't matter how many vehicles you've pre-planned. That 10-day window often means that shipments fall foul of being able to be loaded in time, and ships are leaving not loaded, as in without being fully loaded, simply because of the lack of capacity to get those cleared vehicles onto them in that time frame. Yeah.
Now, moving on, and we'll rattle through these last ones real quick. Problems forecast around EV drivers paying RUC. Documents show the government expects problems regarding getting EV owners to pay road user charges. That's according to Radio New Zealand, who says an e-RUC for electric vehicles is among considerations. One source forecasts increasing non-compliance with RUC and debt for customers entering the system. Others, released under the Official Information Act, said the road user system as it is could not cope, suggesting strategic changes to road user charges to deal with financial pressures as part of a wide regulatory overhaul of transport. The National Party says they won't extend the EV exemption past March 31 next year. You can read more about that on EVs and Beyond. My understanding was one solution that had been floated as part of a study by a member of the Ministry of Transport that's now moved to the NZTA, that I'm sure you two know who I'm talking about, is that the RUC system is what it'll be, but they won't require labels. It'll be a purely online digital system. You got any other take on that, David, from your experience?
This is a subject close to my heart and one that I have been advocating for many years. The best way to manage roads in New Zealand, their construction and their maintenance, along with congestion charging, pollution charging, and all sorts of things, is to move the entire fleet to e-ruck. Easier said than done. But if you run it as a manual system, compliance is not going to be high among people who are not used to it. Diesel owners are used to it. Petrol owners are not, and EV owners. I think there are some strident protesters among the early adopters of EV. So going e-ruck does make sense. It's about 16 or 17 different things you can do with e-ruck. Much more easier than our convoluted system.
I actually think the heart of the EV community, and I do hang around with them a little bit, is actually quite aware that ruck is coming and accepting of it, as long as it's well systemised. And look, to be honest, I'll still be saving money on our two vehicles even when we're paying ruck.
Yeah, you're right. There are a good call there, but there are some who don't want to. But then there are a lot of other people who also don't want to. But going to e-ruck requires a foolproof, tamper-proof system. And I think this society is not quite ready for what they would consider to be big government, because the thing about e-ruck is that then somebody knows where that vehicle is at any one time when it's turned on.
Yeah, that's right.
I think welcome to hell. And I haven't been, and I haven't got all the solutions here, but I haven't been an advocate of a lack of road pricing on EVs since that scheme was introduced. Wasn't my idea, not my monkeys. I can see this being fraught with all sorts of issues, and we are in a historical era of low compliance amongst the public on a variety of different things in the motor vehicle fleet as it is. Good luck, brave person.
Because it's not like ute drivers, ute or courier vans ever try to defraud the ruck system.
Oh, absolutely. Come out to West Auckland, where I'm going to be flying to in a couple of hours if we finish the show on time. And tell me about the lack of compliance in the vehicle fleet in general. If people can get away with not even having to worry about paying registration and warrant of fitness and driving dormant cars for 3 years on their roads, come and show you an entire car park full of them. Good luck on the rucks when it comes to EVs.
Yeah. One thing Simeon has said is that the fees for a lack of rego or warrant need to rise, because it's been $200 forever. I remember back when I was a young teenage driver, the fine back then was, I think, $180, and we're now 23 years later, 24 years, 5 years later, and it hasn't changed.
You're missing the point. It's nothing to do with the fee. It's enforcement. There is no enforcement. It doesn't matter what the fee is at the other end. You tell me last time you saw the police wandering around a car park giving out tickets for lack of registration.
I've seen council employees doing it.
Not in West Auckland. They're not brave enough.
Disputes Tribunal rejects, and I should put in brackets, another $100,000 claim for emotional harm. The Motor Vehicle Disputes Tribunal has rejected a woman's application for $4,000 for repairs to her BMW X5, which she purchased secondhand from a BMW dealership, and a claim of $100,000 for emotional harm. Now, I'm going to, again, we don't need to say much more on this. It's an interesting trend, and that is people who have immigrated from Asian countries requesting emotional harm payments from the Motor Vehicle Disputes Tribunal, only for the Disputes Tribunal to tell them that they don't actually do that. So I'm not sure what you can do about that, but yeah, they're just fun to write because, yeah.
Give us an uppercut, champ.
Couple of things you can look at on the website, which are a bit of fun, more tied to our EV side. EV on a budget. So the MG4 is launched. This is the first electric vehicle you can really get in New Zealand, which after subsidy has a 3 at the start of the price. So $39,990 by the time the subsidy goes on it, basically, or about that. Until October. So go buy it now. Really cool little car. Really impressive car. It's a bit basic in entry-level form. Some of the plastics are a bit meh, but drives really well. Good range. I've got a really good video over there on EVs and Beyond, so go have a look at that. We can go jump over there, look at our initial discussion on the Scorpio, and you can watch us do fun things like this in them.
Oh, look, Richard drives in mud.
Look at that.
Oh, look, Richard spins wheels. Oh,
That's a car for under $50,000 that'll do that. Or ride on its side.
you should see what I do to rental cars on my trips then. Sorry, Hertz.
A little bit of news from this morning. New chief executive for Rutherford Bond and King Toyota, Derek Tilliard, replaced Hunter Mitchell as the chief executive of Wellington-based Rutherford and Bond, Toyota and King Toyota at the beginning of July. So another new, fresh name to management there. And another one, again, if you go to AutoTalk, it'll lead you through to EVs and beyond. We did a couple of videos where we went and drove the Mitsubishi EKX EV at Mitsubishi and the Toyota C-Pod at Toyota. Now, the EKX is interesting, and I think it's got a lot more chance of getting on the road here. It's a K car, relatively small range, but also relatively affordable compared to other EVs out there that if it had a subsidy would likely get into the 20s. First, I think, and Graham might agree with me, we should have more K cars in New Zealand.
Yeah, love me a K car. That was freaking cool. That was neat.
Yep. Graham swung the camera on that one. And the Toyota C-Pod is another interesting one because if they get that across the line, that could open the door for more quadricycles. And I like quadricycles. Do you want to? I was going to say, you've got a caravan, not a motorhome. Would you like a quadricycle to tow behind your motorhome? But you've got a caravan, so you can't really do that, can you, David?
No. Look, all interesting space, and I think some of these things are fine on some of our roads and less fine on other bits of our network. You've heard me before, unless it can do 100 Ks comfortably, it's not going to be fine on all of our network. Yeah. But then does it need to be? That's a good question.
Yeah. The EKX can. The EKX is actually really zippy. Yeah. I really like the EKX. Probably needs a slightly bigger battery, but that car, I think, is New Zealand ready. And if they don't bring it in, I would suggest that some of Graham's cohorts will probably find a few lying around at auction in Japan and put them on a boat and sell them quite easily here, I think.
Sorry,
no?
Did you say something, Richard? Sorry, I can't hear you.
What?
Sorry, what?
What? You've already. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, that's us for today. Probably one of the longest on history. Just short of an hour and a half. Thank you so much for coming along, Graham and David. David's probably off to demolish a shed or build a shed or put his feet up somewhere. Graham, you're probably off to find some
coffee first.
A cup of coffee. There you go. Graham, you're probably off to find a Powerade and a Panadol.
Yeah, pretty much in that order too, I think. And I check out of the hotel room another hour or so, and I might use that time very wisely by doing absolutely nothing and letting my head go down.
And then second breakfast at the Cairo Lounge? Yep.
Got it.
Now, if you are in Auckland, you're going to the Electromobility Summit on Tuesday. I will be there. I'm hosting a panel with a few luminaries of the industry, including your former chairman, I guess he still is, but not to you anymore, David, Simon Rutherford, and a few other industry people talking about electrification. So if you're there, come and say hello. And otherwise, we'll catch you next week, next Friday, same time, for the AutoTalk Weekly Wrap.